this and that, spitting slow, spitting fast. I could roast, I could gas, think I'm okay at last, but I don't know if that can erase all the past and the pettiness.
20 of the most infamous jumping the shark moments. In some ways, television is a medium built on longevity. After all, the longer a series is on air, the more successful it is. However, a long run can be a bit of a double-edged sword, especially when a show has to make imaginative leaps to keep viewers tuned in season after season. Sometimes, these pay off and propel a given show into new realms of success and artistic output. In others, however, such changes end up pushing the show over the edge, so it's worth checking out some of the most infamous jumping the shark moments on television, including, of course, the one that coined the phrase. Has the 1 of 20. Scrubs More Season 9. 8 strong seasons is no mean feat for a sitcom, but that's what Scrubs managed to achieve. However, all good things must come to an end, and Season 9 marks the moment things went irrevocably sideways. In a surprising decision, the series not only moved the show's setting to another hospital, but also replaced most of the cast. This was a big loss for the show and the fans. Unsurprisingly, it never really recovered from the change, and it was the show's final season. 2 of 20. When Suzanne gone, Designing Women. It's easy to spot the moment Designing Women, the popular comedy about 4 women who run an interior design firm in Atlanta, Georgia, jumped the shark. The first episode of the 6th season marked the departure of Delta Burke, who portrayed Susan Sugar Baker. Given that she was central to the show's chemistry, her departure made the show worse. The subsequent departure of Jean Smart, who played the lovable and naive Charlene, also fatally weakened the show. Even the presence of John Hooks, Julia Duffy and Judith Ivey could not save it. 3 out of 20. Will and Grace, when Leo was introduced. In this era of LGBTQ+ popular culture, it's easy to forget just how groundbreaking Will and Grace was when it premiered. Its central foursome of Will, Grace, Jack, and Karen were lovable parts of the television landscape, and their dynamic was an important part of the show's appeal. Unfortunately, in Season 5, the show introduced Dr. Leo, played by Harry Connick, Jr. And nothing was the same. His presence disrupted the central chemistry, and his romance with Grace put a strain on Grace's friendship with Will, so much so that they didn't speak to each other for years. Sometimes, it's better to be alone. 4 out of 20. Roseanne, when the family won the lottery. In its heyday, Roseanne was one of the best comedies on television. Unlike many other series, this series actually gives working-class families a moment in the sun and shows what it was like for blue-collar workers at the end of the 20th century. In Season 9, the show jumped the shark in spectacular fashion, as the family wins the lottery and things go completely off the rails. Not only that, but then it's revealed in the finale that the entire season itself was just a dream, and that, in fact, Dan was dead at the end of the previous season, which adds insult to injury. 5 out of 20. Happiness, when Rachel and Kurt moved to New York. For a while, Ryan Murphy's Glee was one of the most popular shows on television. A catchy mix of comedy, teen drama, and musical, its story about a beleaguered Glee club and its various members was designed for the late 2010s and early 2010s, and for its first 2 seasons, it found its sweet spot. The 3rd season was weak, but the show really jumped the shark when Kurt and Rachel moved to New York. From then on, the series simply continued to add new characters to the main high school roster, losing more focus as time went on. 6 out of 20. That 70s Show, when Eric and Kelso left. That 70s show started in the 90s but ended in the 2000s, and for most of that time it was a very funny and catchy teen sitcom. However, there were a few twists and turns and a few cast changes endured. Arguably the most notable jumping the shark moment was when Kelso Ashton Kutcher walked out of the show. Given how instrumental he was to the group's central chemistry, it was an absence that was never fully filled, and things got worse when Topher Grace's Eric also left, two absences that the show never managed to fill. 7 out of 20. Sherlock, when Sherlock returns to Victorian England for a drug trip. There's an undeniable chemistry between Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman in Sherlock, the modern-day retelling of Arthur Conan Doyle's beloved stories. These two actors play their roles perfectly, and the first 2 seasons made for amazing television. However, the Christmas special that aired after the 3rd season featured the main character using drugs to catapult his mind back to his Victorian past. It might seem like a fun conceit on paper, but on screen, it ends up being overkill, a far-fetched scenario that derailed what plausibility the series had managed to maintain. 8 out of 20. House of Cards, when Frank became president. From the beginning, House of Cards was a show that delighted in pushing the envelope in terms of narrative believability. For a time, it was a lot of fun to see what new scheme Kevin Spacey's Kevin Underwood would manage to cook up as he sought out ever more power for himself. Even in a show that relished the outlandish, however, the moment when Frank Underwood becomes president is, in its own way, a jumping the shark moment. After that, everything becomes just another piece of theater because, having achieved what he sought for so long, there's nowhere else interesting for Frank to go. The rest of the series, including Underwood's death, felt deeply contrived. 9 of 20. Parks and Recreation, when Chris and Ann left. Parks and Recreation was one of the best feel-good shows on television for the entirety of its run. Leslie Knope and company were the type of people the audience could truly cheer for and care about, and the show hit its stride in the 2nd season. Although it didn't have the decline in quality that many shows face, the 6th season was a bit of a collective jumping the shark moment, mainly since both Chris and Ann Perkins left the show. Unlike many shows that jump the shark, however, the series still gave its characters the type of farewell they and the audience deserved. 10 of 20. Game of Thrones, Gendry's run. When Game of Thrones premiered in 2011, it marked a true watershed moment in TV, proving that fantasy could make for compelling viewing. It was going strong until the 8th season, but it quickly became clear that the showrunners were at something of a loss. Although Daenerys' turn to madness is often seen as the nadir, the signs are there, particularly the moment when Gendry is ordered to run back to the Wall, even though they are miles away. All of this was truly a shame, and these vexing moments tarnished the series' reputation for years. 11 of 20. Dexter, when Deb found out Dexter was a serial killer. Like many of the other series of the 2000s and 2010s, Dexter was very much about an anti-hero. One doesn't become more anti-heroic than the title's character, a serial killer who targets other killers. It was a genius concept, and Michael C. Hall was at the top of his game in the title role. The show arguably jumped the shark when his sister, Deb, found out he was a serial killer and vowed to watch out for him so he would stop murdering people. Unfortunately, this particular plot point was antithetical to the whole point of the show, which makes one wonder why it was included in the first place. 12 of 20. Downton Abbey, when Matthew died. Downton Abbey was a beloved part of the TV landscape for its first several seasons. How could it not be when it was juicy melodrama and sudsy costume drama all rolled into one? The 3rd season finale, however, saw the death of the main character, Matthew, right after he'd found happiness with Mary and they were about to be parents. It was like a punch in the gut, and it also set up some narrative problems the show struggled to resolve in its remaining seasons, particularly given the extent to which so many people had invested themselves in the romance and love between Mary and Matthew. 13 of 20. American Horror Story, when Jessica Lange left. American Horror Story has come to be seen as an American institution. Now into its 12th season, the horror anthology shows no signs of slowing down even if Ryan Murphy is no longer the showrunner. It was campy fun for its first 4 seasons, but things changed when Jessica Lange left the show. She'd been so key to the appeal of the first several seasons, creating memorable characters like Sister Jude of Asylum, that not even introducing Lady Gaga for Hotel was enough to save the show. 14 of 20. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, when Buffy was resurrected. For its first few seasons, Buffy the Vampire Slayer was like almost nothing else on television. Part teen drama, part comedy, and part horror, it also featured some great performances and sharp writing from series creator Joss Whedon. Yet even a show as successful and well written as this one had its share of narrative problems, and the resurrection of Buffy in the 6th season is arguably the rarest. While it's easy to see why the show went this route, the show is called Buffy. After all, it did rather negate the emotional impact of her sacrifice and seemed to render the whole thing mood. 15 of 20. Grey's Anatomy, the musical episode. Grey's Anatomy is now one of the longest-running medical dramas on television, and it has made the most out of its blend of melodrama and medicine. Even though it is still going strong, arguably, its jumping the shark moment was when it had its very own musical episode. Some shows manage to pull off this blending of genres, but it has to be said that this was a bit of a misstep. Even though the series managed to get back into its groove after this misbegotten episode, this was still a sign that something had gone more than a little sideways. 16 of 20. Once Upon a Time, when the first season ended. In its first season, Once Upon a Time was one of the most imaginative series on television, with its central premise about a young woman, Emma, who finds herself in a village whose inhabitants are really the inhabitants of a magical land who have been placed under a curse. The first season was a fun mystery as she got closer to solving the central enigma and lifting the curse. Unfortunately, the breaking of the spell at the end of the first season was, in its own way, a jumping the shark moment, as it left the series struggling to find a new sense of identity. It never quite recaptured the unique magic of that first season. 17 of 20. Dallas, the revelation that an entire season was a dream. If there's one scenario that can sink a series, it's the dream sequence. Perhaps no series demonstrates this more than Dallas, the popular 1970s and 1980s soap opera. In this case, an entire season was declared to have been a dream all along, thus practically erasing the events of the 9th season, most notably the death of Patrick Duffy's character, Bobby James Ewing. Although it was pleasant to see the return of Duffy, it's still startling to see an entire season rendered mood, and it's a creative decision that has become infamous in the history of television, and it's even spoofed in an episode of Family Guy. 18 of 20. True Blood, when Sookie was revealed to be a fairy. Given the many zany twists and turns that True Blood took over the course of its run, it's a bit hard to find the exact moment it seemed to run out of creative juice. The real nadir, however, was when Sookie Stackhouse, the series protagonist whose ability to read minds caused her no small amount of trouble, was revealed to be part fairy. While this was true to the novels, and while the series had introduced all manner of supernatural creatures by this point, this just started verging into the realm of the ridiculous, and the weak and undisciplined narrative choices made the problem worse. 19 of 20. The Office, when Michael Scott left. The Office has the distinction of being a successful mix of cringe and endearing, and much of its early success can be attributed to Steve Carell's brilliant performance as Michael Scott. As awkward as he was, however, he was also the connective tissue that held the cast members together, and it's not going too far to say that he was the heart of the show. However, all good things come to an end, and he left in season 7. Although the series carried on without him and was still fun, it was clear that something vital had gone out of it. 20 out of 20. Happy Days, the jumping the shark moment. It's hard to think of a more infamous moment in TV history than the one that gave birth to the term jumping the shark. Although a beloved sitcom for much of its run, Happy Days started to run out of ideas as it went on. In the 5th season, it went completely off the rails when Fonzie, arguably one of the coolest characters ever appearing on the small screen, water-skied over a shark. This has come to be understood as the moment when the show demonstrated a lack of good storytelling ideas, although it would actually continue for several more seasons. 20 of the most infamous jump